Did you know that King David was a man after God's own heart? But even though he was a man after God's own heart, there was consequences for his sin. And in this video, I'm going to share the consequence to sin so it could build your faith and help you understand how to walk in a way that honors God. But if this is your first time at this channel, please hit the subscribe button as I put weekly videos that are geared to build your faith in Jesus Christ. But let's get started. King David was a man after God's own heart, but King David made a lot of choices that were considered dishonoring to God. And there was consequences for them choices. There was consequences for his sin. So the first one I want to talk about with King David is how he looked and lusted after another woman and had a child with a woman that wasn't his wife, but put her own husband on the front line of war so that he could have a higher probability of dying. But back then, King David was smart. He was a warrior. He was a soldier. But he put him on the front line because he knew that he would die, and it would be guaranteed that he could take his wife. So in anyone's eyes, if anyone understood or heard this story, they would say that man is a wicked man. That man made a horrible choice to have someone's husband killed. And we all will agree with that. But even though King David did that, the Bible says that King David was a man after God's own heart. So God had mercy on a mistake and a choice that King David made. And I want to share that with you first, because some of us have made choices. Some of us had made mistakes, but God's mercy and grace is upon those who seek and reach out to him. And one thing about King David, he was a man after God's own heart, so he was a repenting man. He went and repented. He knew he was wrong. He acknowledged the wickedness, and he came before God and asked God to forgive him, to deliver him, to search his heart, to remove anything from his heart that wasn't of God. But let me tell you about the consequence of that sin. As King David did this act of evil, he then took the woman and she was going to have his child. A prophet then came to King David and told him a story. And King David said, "That's a wicked man. Who would do that?" And the prophet said, "That man is you." And King David understood in that moment that he had done a wicked act after feeling conviction from a prophet who told him that story. But that wasn't it. Just because he felt conviction, just because he felt repented and he wanted to make things right, there were still consequences to that sin. The consequence to that sin was that God said that the child that she was going to have, that Bathsheba was going to have, was going to die. So King David lost his son, lost his child because of sin. The second one is that King David not only lost his child because of sin, but King David also had a family that was very dysfunctional. King David's own son raped his own sister. And because of that, his other son killed his brother because he raped his sister. So in all this, you see consequences of sin. You see David neglected his children for war, for the kingdom, for all these things, but not having a true grip on a thing that matters most, and that's your household, that's your family. Your first ministry is your family, what God has entrusted you with. How are you raising it? How are you imparting into that? How are you allowing God to lead you, to lead your family into a place where they acknowledge and have reverence for God? So we know that even though King David was a man after God's own heart, his children struggled with understanding the concept of honoring God. When you could do that to your sister and then you could go and murder your brother, there's got to be a disconnect, a separation from God in that instance or in that season of their life. But that's not it. Let me share with you some more of King David's story, because King David could not even build the temple of God. He wanted to, he had desires to do it, but God said, nope, you're not going to build it. Your son Solomon is going to build it because you have too much blood on your hands. So King David had too much blood on his hands. He murdered so many people, and only God knows if it was for a just or unjust reason. But we do know one thing, that God did not let him build the temple because there was too much blood on his hands, or like most say, too much sin on his hands, because murder is sin. Now that's not only it, there's more to his story. So after that, his own son tries to dethrone him. His own son tries to take his kingdom from his dad, King David. King David flees, don't want to hurt his son, but through the midst of all that, his son ends up getting murdered and dying. And King David is broken, and he comes and takes the kingdom back. But the point of this video is not to tell you that all these bad things are going to happen in your life. The point of this story is to build your faith and help you see that if you're playing or dibbling or dabbling with sin, there's consequences to it. God will forgive us. God does have grace and mercy. But through it all, you still have to reap the consequences of your sin. If I cheat on my wife, yes, God might forgive me or will forgive me if I'm truly repentant. But that doesn't mean that my wife is going to take me back as her husband. And I'm going to have to live and deal with that sin and that consequence of that sin while losing my wife and losing my family. So before you think that you can just get sky-free away with sin and you think God's grace could cover it, because it can, there's still a natural consequence to our choices, a natural consequence to our sin. And that's what I want to expound in this video. How many of us go day in day making choices after choice, dibbling and dabbling in sin, kind of like King David in a sense? We want to do right before God. We have a heart for God. We're repentant. We don't want to do it. But we're experiencing all these things in our life that are just shattering our world. And we're saying, what's going on? And I want to tell you, it might be the consequences of your sin, because there's natural consequences to that. We are going to have to deal with the effects of our sin, even though God forgives us. So in this video, look at King David's life, and I want to encourage you to read the whole life of King David, to study the life of King David, and see how you can take wisdom from it and learn from King David's mistakes and say, hey, even though I mess up here, even though I make a mistake here, I'm not going to let that deter my relationship with God, because that's a positive we could take for King David's life, is that even though he fell short and he sinned, he was a man after God's own heart. He was a repentant man. He always came back to God because he believed that God was who he said he was. And God is who he said he was. He is faithful. He is loving. He is compassionate. He has mercy and grace for you no matter what you have done. But I want you to understand that sometimes we put ourselves in difficult situations and difficult life circumstances because we're continually walking in disobedience or sin with God. So as you read King David's life, look at it, learn from it, ask God to give you wisdom. But remember, there's consequences to our sin. And I want to bless you and help you understand that no matter what happens, keep pushing it to God, keep repenting, but understand, just because God forgives you doesn't mean you won't deal with certain consequences to your choices. And like always, be blessed.